Welcome back, fifth graders, to another section of spooky stories from the Scary Stories Treasury. I'm Mr. Lures, and let's not waste another second. Let's get in to the first spooky story. This one is titled The Hook. Donald and Sarah went to the movies. Then they went for a ride in Donald's car. They parked up on a hill at the edge of town. From there, they could see the lights up and down the valley. Donald turned on the radio and found some music. But an announcer broke in with a news bulletin. A murderer had escaped from state prison. He was armed with a knife and was headed south on foot. His left hand was missing. In its place, he wore a hook. "Let's roll up the windows and lock the doors," said Sarah. "That's a good idea," said Donald. "The prison isn't too far away," said Sarah. "Maybe we should go home." "But it's only 10 o'clock," said Donald. "I don't care what time it is," she said. "I want to go home." "Look, Sarah," said Donald. "He's not going to climb all the way up here. Why would he do that? Even if he did, all the doors are locked. How could he get in?" "Donald, he could take that hook and break through a window and open a door," she said. "I'm scared, and I want to go home." Donald was annoyed. "Girls are always afraid of something," he said. Just as he started the car, Sarah thought she heard something, or someone, scratching at the door. "Did you hear that?" she asked as they roared away. "It sounded like somebody was trying to get in." "Oh, sure," said Donald. Soon they got to her house. "Would you like to come in and have some cocoa?" she asked. "No," he said. "I've got to go home." He went around to the other side of the car to let her out, and hanging on the door handle was a hook. The next spooky story is the white satin evening gown. A young man invited a young woman to a formal dance. She was very poor, and she could not afford to buy the evening gown she needed for such an occasion. "Maybe you can rent a dress," her mother said. So she went to a pawn shop not far from where she lived. There she found a white satin evening gown in her size. She looked lovely in it, and she was able to rent it for very little. When she arrived at the dance with her friend, she was so attractive everyone wanted to meet her. She danced again and again and was having a wonderful time. But then she began to feel dizzy and faint, and she asked her friend to take her home. "I think I've danced too much," she told him. When she got home, she lay down on her bed. The next morning, her mother had found that her daughter had died. The doctor did not understand what had caused her death. So they had the coroner perform an autopsy. The coroner found that she had been poisoned by embalming fluid. It had stopped her blood from flowing. There were traces of the fluid on her dress. He decided it had entered her skin when she perspired while she was dancing. The pawnbroker said he bought the dress from an undertaker's helper. It had been used in a funeral for another young woman, and the helper had stolen it just before she was buried. The next spooky story is titled High Beams. The girl driving the old blue sedan was a senior at high school. She lived on a farm about 8 miles away and used the car to drive back and forth. She had driven into town that night to see a basketball game. Now she was on her way home. As she pulled away from the school, she noticed a red pickup truck follow her out of the parking lot. A few minutes later, the truck was still behind her. "I guess we're going the same direction," she thought. She began to watch the truck in her mirror. When she changed her speed, the truck driver changed his speed. When she passed a car, so did he. Then he turned on his high beams, flooding the car with light. He left them on for almost a minute. "He probably wants to pass me," she thought, but she was becoming uneasy. Usually she drove home over a back road. Not too many people went that way, but when she turned onto the road, so did the truck. "I've got to get away from him," she thought, and she began to drive faster. Then he turned on his high beams on again. After a minute, he turned them off. Then he turned them on and turned them off. She drove even faster, but the truck driver stayed right behind her. Then he turned on his high beams again. Once more, her car was ablaze with light. What is he doing, she wondered. What does he want? Then he turned them off again. But a minute later, he had them on again. And he had them, and then he left them on. At last, she pulled into her driveway, and the truck pulled in right behind her. She jumped from the car and ran to the house. Call the police, she screamed at her father. Out in the driveway, she could hear the driver of the truck. He had a gun in his hand. When the police arrived, they started to arrest him, but he pointed to the girl's car. You don't want me, he said. You want him. Crouched behind the driver's seat, there was a man with a knife. As the driver of the truck explained it, the man slipped into the girl's car just before she left school. He saw it happen, but there was no way he could stop it. He thought about getting the police, but he was too afraid to leave her, so he followed her car. Each time the man in the back seat reached up to overpower her, the driver of the truck turned on his high beams. Then the man dropped down, afraid someone might see him. The next spooky story is titled The Babysitter. It was 9 o'clock in the evening. Everybody was sitting on the couch in front of the TV. There were Richard, Brian, Jenny, and Doreen, the babysitter. The telephone rang. Maybe it's your mother, said Doreen. She picked up the phone. Before she could say a word, a man laughed hysterically and hung up. Who was it? Asked Richard. Some nut, said Doreen. What did I miss? At 9:30, the telephone rang again. Doreen answered it. It was the man who had called before. I'll be there soon, he said, and he laughed and hung up. Who was it? The children asked. Some crazy person, she said. About 10 o'clock, the telephone rang again. Jenny got to it first. Hello, she said. It was the same man. One more hour, he said, and he laughed and he hung up. He said 1 more hour. What did he mean? Asked Jenny. Don't worry, said Doreen. It's somebody fooling around. I'm scared, said Jenny. About 10:30, the telephone rang once more. When Doreen picked it up, the man said, Pretty soon now, and he laughed. Why are you doing this? Doreen screamed, and he hung up. Was it that guy again? Asked Brian. Yes, said Doreen. I'm going to call the operator and complain. The operator told her to call back if it happened again, and she would trace the call. At 11 o'clock, the telephone rang once more. Doreen answered it. Very soon now, the man said, and he laughed and hung up. Doreen called the operator. Almost at once, she called back. The person is calling from a telephone upstairs, she said. You better leave. I'll get the police. Just then a door upstairs opened. A man they had never seen before started down the stairs toward them. As they ran from the house, he was smiling in a very strange way. A few minutes later, the police found him there and arrested him. So, friends, that was the end of this section of the Scary Stories Treasury. I hope to see you next time when we read another section. As for me, I'm Mr. Lures. Have a wonderful night, friends.